If you have followed my channel long enough, you know I firmly believe one of Sega's biggest mistakes with the Saturn was its lack of its own successful franchises from the 8 and 16-bit platforms. Sega had explosive success with a number of its IPs on the Master System and Genesis lines, almost all of which would not go on to the Saturn in any form. In this episode, we take a look at the 5 franchises that I feel Sega should have made sure had Saturn versions, and offer some opinions as to what these games may have looked like. Before we begin, let's take a look at some of the successful franchises that Sega did bring to the Saturn and how they fared. In June of 1995, the Saturn got its own entry into the Shinobi line of games, Shin Shinobi-den. Much of the gameplay here is based on the advancements made in Shinobi 3. It was a nice playing game that was presented with digitized characters and environments. It was known as Shinobi Legions in the US and Shinobi X in Europe, the latter receiving a different soundtrack as well. The first 2 Shining Force games had been great additions to the Genesis library, and when the series was brought to the Saturn, it was in 3 separate scenarios that told one epic story. The 3D graphics were impressive, the music memorable, and the turn-based combat the best the series had seen. Only the first of the scenarios would come west, but fan translations made sure we all could see the story proper. Golden Axe had been a great series of games across the arcade and Genesis for years. They followed the hack-and-slash beat-em-up style of gameplay, allowing multiple players to wreak havoc with screen-filling magic attacks. It was a shock when the Saturn game showed up, as it completely dropped the previous game's style and opted to change it all to a one-on-one fighting game. Sega Sports had been a big part of the Genesis library in the early to mid-90s. Sega developed just about every mainstream sport you can think of, and many of them came over to the Saturn at some point in its life. Standouts include the World Series baseball games, which were some of the best looking games on the system, and the Olympic-style games Decathlete and Winter Heat, 2 games that could test even the strongest friendships. Their worldwide soccer games were solid too, again often being some of the best running games the system had. NBA action improved strongly over the life of the Saturn, and even their NHL hockey games were quite playable. The Columns games were well known on all of Sega's platforms, and they must have sold fairly well because Sega would wrap them all up in one package and release them on the Saturn as Columns Arcade Collection. They didn't stop there because this compilation also included the exclusive STV Titan arcade version, Columns 97. It's a good pack of games if you like the genre, and covers just about everything the series had to offer in the 1990s. Of course, this episode is about the series the Saturn actually needed, and I have 5 choices here that I think the Saturn absolutely had to have for Genesis and Master System owners to take notice of the console. There are many out there that will tell you that the beat-em-up genre was dead during the 32-bit generation, that it was overrun with generic entries that had stagnated the genre and killed interest. I don't believe that for a second, and I think that the Saturn not having a Streets of Rage entry was a massive mistake. Like every other genre that moved from 2D to 3D, beat 'em up simply needed to adapt to the new climate of the industry. Streets of Rage could have gone a number of ways. Perhaps a 2.5D route that gave you the ability to buy outfits, weapons, healing items, and armor. Maybe it could have had multiple routes to take like some of Sega's other franchises, leading to secret areas that could change the story or allow you to unlock characters you could use later. Maybe a fully integrated RPG system that allowed you to build and enhance a fighter. Hell, I would have taken a Streets of Rage that was modeled after Die Hard Arcade. Battles taking place in small areas and moving from scene to scene to progress the story. Sega had its blueprints right in front of it from games in its own stable of IPs, yet we received nothing at all. Games like Streets of Rage helped define the Sega experience for many people, and to not have a new entry on the Saturn was just mystifying. Despite not outputting nearly as many RPGs as companies like Square or Enix, Sega made some fine contributions to the genre during the 8 and 16-bit eras. Phantasy Star happened to be one of those games, showing up once on the Master System and 3 times on the Genesis. The series was well respected in the face of Sega RPGs for years, and man was it a mistake to not bring a new one to the Saturn. Like most of you know, the RPG genre saw something of a mainstream renaissance towards the end of the life of the Super Nintendo and into the life of the Sony PlayStation. Sega was not prepared for this reality, and then didn't even bring out most of the Japanese RPGs it did have. Phantasy Star should have been a series that spanned at least 2 games on the Saturn, and with the way those games were made, the Saturn was primed to do one hell of an engine for them. High-detailed 2D backdrops with 3D characters would have worked great on the Saturn, or maybe even go back to the first Phantasy Star with explorable 3D dungeons and such. I mean, Sega had made 4 Phantasy Star games at this point, and they were again well-respected games that often commanded great reviews and user opinions. Sega didn't even try with the series, and the only thing we'd see was a Japanese-only Sega Ages release that contained the original 8 and 16-bit games. I know what you're thinking, the Saturn got a bunch of Sonic games, what are you talking about? Well, it did and it didn't. While it did get ports of the 16-bit Sonic games, Sonic 3D Blast and Sonic R, none of these were mainline Sonic games created just for the Saturn. Of all the games I list in this episode, this has to be the biggest boneheaded thing Sega could have done. I mean, Sonic was the face of the company, the defining character that brought millions of customers their way only a mere 3 years before the Saturn landed in Japan. How was there not a dedicated Sonic game ready at the launch of at the very least the US and European Saturn? I mean, even if Yuji Naka and Sonic Team wanted to do something else, you bring in the team that did Sonic CD to make a new game. Even if that new team faced time limits and had trouble getting a fully 3D engine up and running on the Saturn, you adjust, make the big decisions, and make Sonic a 2.5D game that still had loads of polygons everywhere for people to talk about. You do anything, and I mean anything, to make sure that Sonic gets well represented on your brand new $400 platform. You don't waste money on stuff like Congo, Blackfire, Gen War. You don't spread resources to projects that mean absolutely nothing while the face of your company is floundering, trying to piece together a project that had been going badly from the moment of its inception. Sonic was Sega, its image, its attitude, and there were still millions of gamers playing those games in 1995 when the Saturn landed in the US and Europe. For Sega to not pull that project together, to not have a plan B, C, D, and even F, really shows you the state of things within Sega's hierarchy. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a travesty that remains a gaping hole in millions of Sega fans' heart to this very day. I know many of you didn't think much of Eternal Champions. It was definitely a game that was an acquired taste, but I feel that with its brand recognition among Sega fans, Sega missed a big opportunity with this franchise. Let me put you a scenario. Virtua Fighter was not the same game in the West that it was in Japan. In its home country, it was considered one of the premier fighting games of the time. It was in every arcade across the country and helped make the Saturn a hit when it was brought home. None of this happened in the US and Europe. Gamers flocked to fighting games with more personality, unlockables, and extra modes beyond the one-on-one fighting. The Virtua Fighter games had seemed bare bones in comparison, having none of the content that had made stuff like Tekken a fan favorite. So what was the answer to this quagmire, you ask? It was Eternal freaking Champions, I tell you. AM2 creates this gorgeous high-resolution fighting engine for Virtua Fighter 2 within Sega. Imagine, if you will, that Sega then takes all the crazy characters from Eternal Champions, the moves, the stage fatalities, the combos, and puts it within the basic guard punch kick structure of Virtua Fighter 2. The backgrounds could have been super detailed 2D locations with lots of VDP2 background scaling and rotation elements like water and buildings, leaving the high-res polygon models to wow fans. The easy interface is based on big juggle combos, sort of a mix of Virtua Fighter and the 2D Eternal Champions game. You load it with secrets like unlockable characters, special stages, endings, and full stories for each and every character. Sega had the engine, they had the content blueprint from their Sega CD release of Challenge from the Dark Side. All they needed to do was understand their market. During the Master System and Genesis runs, there were multiple entries into the Illusion series of Mickey Mouse games. These games are among many Sega fans' favorites for their great graphics, sound, and gameplay. They scratched the itch of a good platformer, while offering kids something they could play that didn't destroy them from the moment they pressed the start button. Sega's relationship with Disney had been strong, and produced many memorable games across many different licenses, making the pair a big draw to Sega's home platforms. And somehow, either through complete incompetence or some cosmic deity hell-bent on Sega's destruction, not a single new game of their type made it to the Saturn. No Castle of Illusion 2, no Land of Illusion 2, not even a newfangled Universe of Illusion to help the Saturn's image with longtime fans. The only thing we'd see on Saturn was a Sega Ages release of the Mega Drive and Genesis versions of Castle of Illusion and Quackshot, which never left Japan. Years later, we did finally see a 2.5D remake of Castle of Illusion for the Xbox 360, PS3, PC, and mobile devices, which would have been glorious as something on the Saturn. The frustrating thing is, again, Sega had the blueprint for this kind of game already in its stable, something that looked as if it came from an Illusion game in the first place. Sega even still had a great working relationship with Disney at the time, with Legend of Illusion showing up on the Game Gear in 1995. What I want you to take away from this episode is how I feel about how Sega handled its image when transitioning to the Saturn. Sega had an image with the Master System and Genesis across the world, a face that was defined by the IPs its customers knew and loved. When Saturn showed up, most of these games that defined the Sega experience were nowhere to be found. Sega's image didn't transfer from one platform to another. It was almost as if the home hardware arm of Sega died with the Genesis, and Saturn was a complete rebranding, using arcade IPs like Daytona and Virtua Fighter as its foundation. The problem there was, while many of the Saturn's games like Panzer Dragoon and Clockwork Knight were fun games, nobody knew anything about them in 1995 when they showed up. They didn't have the built-in audience recognition of all the software that Sega had done before Saturn was released. The proper strategy would have been to offer these games in addition to the tried and true properties I just went over. Imagine not being able to play just Panzer Dragoon in 1995, but also firing up Streets of Rage 4. Sega wasted so many resources on other projects that there simply was no excuse that it played out the way it did. Sega had a heck of a fight in front of them with Sony, and I have always conceded that they were never going to win that battle. But had they considered the importance of their brand and IP recognition that was built up through the years of the Master System and Genesis platforms, we could have seen the difference between a Saturn platform that was utterly slaughtered and one that sold well enough to avoid the impending doom of the entire hardware division. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.